The story begins in 1989, where we're introduced to Dr. Hank Pym, a brilliant scientist who invented the powerful Pym particles and created the original Ant-Man suit. Using this technology, Hank became Ant-Man and secretly protected his country from dangerous threats. The suit could shrink a person down to the size of an ant while allowing them to keep their full strength, but Hank knew just how dangerous the Pym particles really were, which is why he never wanted the formula to fall into the wrong hands. Unfortunately, Howard Stark and a Hydra operative named Mitchell wanted to recreate the technology and develop their own version of the formula. When Hank discovers their plan, he becomes furious. Mitchell mocks him, saying that he couldn't even save his own wife. Enraged, Hank punches him in the face and breaks his nose. Howard tries to calm him down and says, "We can use Pym technology to help people, work with us." But Hank refuses. "I can't trust you, and as long as I'm alive, this formula will never belong to anyone else." With that, he resigns from SHIELD organization and walks away. The story then jumps to the present day. We meet Scott Lang, a man serving time in prison. Despite being behind bars, Scott isn't actually a bad person. Years earlier, he worked for a company called VistaCorp and discovered that the company was stealing money from its customers. So Scott hacked into their system and returned the stolen money to the people. Unfortunately, that still made him a criminal in the eyes of the law. After serving 3 years in prison, Scott is finally released. Waiting outside is his best friend Louise, a small-time thief with a big personality. Louise immediately tells Scott that he has an incredible job opportunity that could make them rich. But Scott quickly shuts him down. "I can't go back to prison. I need to take care of my daughter, Cassie." Determined to stay honest, Scott gets a job at Baskin-Robbins under the fake name Jake, so nobody discovers his criminal record. Things seem to be going well until his manager, Dale, finds out that Scott spent 3 years in prison for stealing from VistaCorp. Scott tries to explain that he did it to help people, but it doesn't matter. He's fired on the spot. Frustrated and out of options, Scott returns to Luis's apartment. There, Luis introduces him to his two partners, Kurt, a skilled hacker, and Dave, a not-so-skilled thief. The group offers Scott a place on their next heist because he's an expert at breaking into secure locations, but Scott refuses. He's determined to stay on the right path. Meanwhile, we return to Hank Pym. Years after being forced out of the company he founded, Pym Technologies, Hank visits the company once again. The company is now being run by his former protege, Dr. Darren Cross. Hank's daughter, Hope Van Dyne, is also there. After years of separation, their relationship remains distant. Hope now serves as the chairwoman of the company. Darren proudly reveals that after years of research, he has finally succeeded in creating a suit similar to Ant-Man's. Standing before investors and military clients, Darren explains that his invention can shrink a person down to insect size while maintaining full human strength. According to him, the technology could be used to bring peace to the world. He calls the suit the Yellow Jacket. One senior executive warns him that if the technology falls into the wrong hands, it could become incredibly dangerous. But Darren ignores the warning. Hank is horrified. He tells Darren that he kept the Ant-Man technology hidden for decades, specifically to prevent it from becoming a weapon. Darren responds bitterly, "We could have built this together, but you never trusted me." Then Hank learns something even worse. Darren has already agreed to sell the Yellow Jacket technology to Mitchell and his organization, the same people involved in dangerous political operations around the world. Realizing how serious the threat is, Hope tells her father they must destroy the Yellow Jacket project before it's completed. She offers to wear the Ant-Man suit herself and carry out the mission, but Hank refuses. The mission is far too dangerous. Instead, he reveals that he already has someone else in mind. Elsewhere, Scott attends his daughter Cassie's birthday party. Cassie is thrilled to see her father. She loves him more than anyone. But Scott's relationship with his ex-wife Maggie is complicated. After their divorce, Maggie became engaged to a police officer named Jim Paxton. Maggie asks Scott to leave. Scott explains that he wants to support Cassie financially because he loves her and wants to be part of her life. Maggie replies, "Get a steady job, get your life together, then you can see her more often." She reminds him that Cassie sees him as a hero, and if he wants to stay her hero, he needs to become a better man. Scott leaves the party feeling defeated. If he ever wants to see Cassie regularly again, he needs a real job and a stable life. But finding work isn't easy for an ex-con. Meanwhile, over at Pym Technologies, Darren Cross continues becoming more ruthless. When senior executive Frank openly opposes the Yellow Jacket project, Darren eliminates him without hesitation. Back on the outside, Scott keeps applying for jobs, but nobody wants to hire someone with a criminal record. The bills are piling up, and without money, he knows he'll never be able to support Cassie. Eventually, with no other options left, Scott goes back to Louis and asks about that robbery. Louis immediately lights up and explains the plan. According to his cousin, a retired old man owns a massive safe filled with cash, and the old guy is supposedly leaving town for an entire week. To Luis, it sounds like the perfect target. Scott finally agrees. Soon the crew gathers their equipment and heads to the mansion. Late that night, they sneak inside. Scott makes his way down into the basement where the vault is located. The first obstacle is a fingerprint scanner, but thanks to his skills, Scott manages to bypass it. Unfortunately, there's another security door behind it. This one is made from an incredibly strong steel alloy. Still, Scott stays calm. Using a drill, liquid nitrogen, and water pressure, he cleverly weakens the metal and breaks through the door. After all that effort, he finally reaches the vault. But when he opens it, there's no money, no gold, nothing valuable at all, just a strange motorcycle-like suit sitting in the middle of the room. Confused, Scott assumes it's some expensive biker gear and stuffs it into his bag before leaving. What he doesn't know is that the suit belongs to Hank Pym himself, and even more surprisingly, Hank has been watching the entire break-in through a tiny ant hidden nearby. This wasn't a robbery, it was a test, and Hank has already decided that Scott Lang is the man he wants to become the next Ant-Man. Meanwhile, Darren Cross continues experimenting with his version of the Pym particle formula. He's trying to shrink living creatures successfully, but every single test ends in disaster. 34 experiments have already failed, and every test animal has died, yet Darren doesn't seem bothered at all. Instead of stopping, he orders the experiments to continue. Back at home, Scott examines the strange suit he stole. Curiosity gets the better of him. While standing in the bathroom, he decides to put it on. The moment he presses one of the buttons on the glove, everything changes. Suddenly, Scott shrinks down to the size of an insect and crashes toward the floor. Panicking, he hears a mysterious voice speaking through the suit. It's Hank Pym. Your trial has begun. Before Scott can process what's happening, Luis enters the bathroom and turns on the bathtub faucet. To tiny Scott, the water looks like a massive tidal wave. He gets swept away, crashes through the house, and tumbles through an impossible series of dangers. A toy train looks like a real locomotive. Household objects become giant obstacles. And after one terrifying adventure after another, Scott finally lands on a car outside. Moments later, he returns to normal size. Completely terrified, Scott wants nothing to do with the suit. Hank contacts him and tells him to keep it, promising they'll speak again soon. But Scott refuses. That same night, he sneaks back to the mansion and returns the suit. Unfortunately, as soon as he leaves, the police arrest him. From their perspective, he just broke into a wealthy man's house. Everything points to attempted burglary. While Scott sits in custody, a lawyer arrives to meet him. That lawyer turns out to be Hank Pym. Hank calmly tells Scott, "I know everything about you. I know what happened at VistaCorp. I know you were trying to help people." Then Hank gives him a choice. You can stay here and finish another prison sentence, or you can put that suit back on and become the hero your daughter already believes you are. Hank reveals that the entire robbery was planned from the beginning. He intentionally allowed Scott to steal the suit. In fact, he even planted the fake story that eventually reached Luird's cousin. All of it was designed to bring Scott to him, because Hank believes Scott is the only person capable of completing the mission. After delivering the offer, Hank leaves. Back inside prison, Scott thinks carefully about his future. Finally, he makes his choice. Using the Ant-Man suit secretly delivered by a swarm of ants, Scott shrinks down and escapes from his cell. The guards are left completely confused. One second he's there, the next second he's gone. Police begin searching everywhere, but they can't find any trace of him. Soon, Hank contacts Scott again and introduces him to his new teammates, the ants. At first, Scott completely freaks out. The idea of working with thousands of insects is not exactly appealing, but Hank reassures him and explains that the ants can be controlled and trained. Then, using a flying ant as transportation, Hank sends Scott on his first real ride. Unfortunately, Scott isn't ready for it. The experience is so overwhelming that he becomes dizzy almost immediately and passes out. When Scott finally wakes up, he finds himself inside Hank Pym's house. Hope tells him to come downstairs. As Scott carefully makes his way through the house, he has to avoid swarms of bullet ants crawling everywhere. He's completely shocked by what he sees. Ants are doing almost everything around the house. Confused, Scott asks Hank, "How are you doing all of this?" Hank explains, ants can lift up to 50 times their own body weight. They build, farm, cooperate, and function as a perfect society. He then reveals that he uses a special device that communicates with them through electromagnetic signals, enhancing their natural instincts and allowing him to guide their behavior. As fascinating as it sounds, Scott still doesn't understand why Hank brought him here. That's when Hank leads him into a secret laboratory hidden beneath the house. There, he finally reveals the truth. 40 years ago, Hank discovered a formula that allowed him to manipulate the distance between atoms. That breakthrough led to the creation of the Ant-Man suit, but the technology was incredibly dangerous. So dangerous that Hank spent decades hiding it from the world. He even founded Pym Technologies to keep control of his research. Hank explains that years earlier, he hired Darren Cross as his assistant because Darren was brilliant. In fact, Hank cared about him almost like a son, but Darren eventually became obsessed with the secrets Hank refused to share. He heard rumors about something called the Pym particle and became determined to recreate it it at any cost. When Hank refused to help him, Darren turned against him and eventually forced him out of his own company. Now Darren is rushing to perfect the Yellow Jacket suit, and if that technology falls into the wrong hands, the consequences could be catastrophic. Hank then explains the mission. They need to infiltrate PIM Technologies, destroy all of Darren's research data, steal the Yellow Jacket prototype, and eliminate it before it can be sold. Scott listens carefully before suggesting, "Wouldn't it be easier to call the Avengers?" Hank immediately shakes his head. "I spent half my life keeping this technology away from Howard Stark. There's no way I'm handing it over to Tony Stark." Scott then jokes, "Why not just send the ants?" Hank smiles and replies, "Ants can do many things, but they still need a leader." After hearing the full story, Scott finally agrees to help. Meanwhile, Darren Cross continues his experiments, and for the first time, he successfully shrinks a living creature using his version of the PIM particle formula. The breakthrough makes him incredibly excited. His dangerous project is finally working. Soon after, Hank and Hope begin Scott's training. The first step is teaching him how to control the suit and switch between sizes. Scott quickly becomes fascinated by the technology. At one point, he starts messing with the suit's regulator. Hank immediately stops him. "Don't touch that." Scott asks why. That's when Hank explains something terrifying. "If you damage the regulator, you'll shrink beyond the atomic level and enter the quantum realm." Scott looks completely confused, so Hank breaks it down for him. "You'd become smaller than atoms themselves. You'd enter a place where time and space no longer function the way we understand them. And once you're there, you may never come back. You'd lose everything you know and everyone you love." For the first time, Scott realizes just how dangerous the suit really is. After that, Hope begins training him in hand-to-hand combat. The lessons are brutal. Every day she pushes him harder. Meanwhile, Hank introduces Scott to the different ant species that will help during the mission. First, he meets the so-called crazy ants. At first, Scott thinks they're adorable. A few seconds later, an entire swarm attacks him. Next come the bullet ants. Hank explains that their sting is incredibly painful and can be used against enemies. Then Scott learns to control flying carpenter ants, which can carry him through the air and serve as transportation. Finally, Hank introduces him to fire ants. These ants specialize in construction and can quickly build bridges and pathways when needed. Once Scott understands the basics, Hank hands him the electromagnetic communication device. His next challenge is learning how to command the ants himself. Unfortunately, he can't do it. No matter how hard he tries, nothing happens. Watching him struggle, Hope loses patience. "We don't have time for this. I can do this mission myself." To prove her point, she immediately uses the device and effortlessly commands the ants, but Hank refuses. Again, that decision sparks another argument between father and daughter. Furious, Hope storms out of the room. Later, Scott finds her outside. Trying to help, he tells her, "Hank only says no because he cares about you. He doesn't want you getting hurt." Hope looks at him and replies, "You think this is a game? This mission is dangerous. You should be worrying about your daughter." Scott pauses for a moment before answering, "I am. Everything I'm doing for her." Outside the house, Hope finally opens up to Scott about her past. She tells him that when her mother disappeared, her father shut her out completely. "For 2 weeks, he wouldn't even talk to me." Scott tries to defend Hank. He was grieving, but Hope shakes her head. "I was grieving too. I was only 7 years old, yet instead of staying with me, he sent me away to boarding school." She explains that for years she believed Hank might eventually change and rebuild their relationship. But every time she tried to get closer to him, he pushed her away again. And worst of all, he never told her the truth about what happened to her mother. Scott listens quietly before responding, "Hank loves you. He's just terrified of losing you too." Then Scott talks about himself. "Honestly, my life hasn't exactly meant much. I'm an ex-con, a thief. The only thing I really care about is giving Cassie a better future, and that's why I'm here." For the first time, Hope begins to understand him. Then she offers him some advice. "If you want to control the ants, you have to clear your mind. Focus on one thing. Think about Cassie. Think about how badly you want to see her again. Use that feeling." Scott follows her advice. He closes his eyes, focuses completely, and finally, the ants respond. For the first time, Scott successfully controls them. Meanwhile, Hank finally tells Hope the truth about her mother's disappearance. Years ago, Janet insisted on joining him during a mission. Back in 1987, a nuclear missile had been launched toward the United States. The missile's casing was protected by solid titanium. There was no way to reach the internal guidance system from the outside. To stop it, someone would have to shrink beyond the atomic level and travel between the molecules. Normally, Hank would have done it, but his regulator had been damaged. Without hesitation, Janet activated her own regulator. She shrank into the quantum realm and successfully disabled the missile. The world was saved, but Janet never came back. Her sacrifice trapped her inside the quantum realm forever. Hank explains that after losing Janet, he dedicated his life to studying the quantum realm. He even distanced himself from Hope because he couldn't bear the thought of losing her too. But despite all his efforts, he never found a way to bring Janet home. Hope's eyes fill with emotion. She finally understands the truth. It wasn't your fault, she tells him. Mom made that choice herself. At last, the years of anger and misunderstanding between them begin to fade away. Watching from nearby, Scott can't help but smile. As the training continues, Scott becomes better and better with the Ant-Man suit. He even names his favorite flying ant, Anthony. Before the mission, Hank creates 2 special discs that act as weapons. The red discs can shrink objects. The blue discs can enlarge them. With these new tools, Scott becomes even more dangerous. Soon, Hank reveals the final phase of the plan. To destroy Yellow Jacket and erase Darren's research, they first need a specialized signal device. The device was originally created during Hank's days with S.H.I.E.L.D. organization. Without it, breaking through Darren's security systems will be nearly impossible. The problem is that the device is stored in an old Stark warehouse in New York. Scott heads there with his ant army, but when he arrives, he immediately realizes something is wrong. The warehouse is gone. Standing in its place is the Avengers facility. Back at headquarters, Hank is shocked. He immediately tells Scott to abort the mission, but Scott grins and says, "Well, now that I'm here, I can't leave empty-handed." Then he jumps onto the roof. Unfortunately, someone spots him. Sam Wilson, also known as Falcon. Thanks to his advanced goggles, Falcon can actually see the tiny intruder. Scott returns to normal size and introduces himself. "Hi, huge fan. My name's Ant-Man." Falcon looks completely confused. "I've never heard of Ant-Man." Scott awkwardly explains that he's kind of new and only needs to borrow a piece of technology to save the world. He even promises to return it, but Falcon isn't buying it. A fight breaks out. What follows is an incredible battle. Scott constantly changes size, making himself nearly impossible to hit. Falcon uses his wings, aerial maneuvers, and advanced weapons to fight back. The two exchange blow after blow. Eventually, Scott finds an opening. He sneaks into the facility, steals the signal device, and heads for the exit. Falcon chases after him, but Scott shrinks down, slips inside Falcon's suit, and sabotages it from the inside. Falcon crashes hard, completely defeated. Scott escapes with the device. The loss is so embarrassing that Falcon decides not to tell Captain America what happened. Back at Hank's house, Scott returns with the device. Hank is thrilled. Now they finally have everything they need. Scott then recruits Luis, Kurt, and Dave to help with the operation. Their job is simple: create distractions and weaken the facility's security systems. When Scott demonstrates the Ant-Man suit to them, they're completely terrified. Watching a grown man shrink into an insect-sized superhero is not something they expected. Still, everyone agrees to help. The mission begins. Luis sneaks into PIM Technologies disguised as a security guard. Once inside, he lowers the building's water pressure exactly as planned. Using a bridge built by his army of crazy ants, Scott starts making his way toward the company's servers. At the same time, Darren brings Hank and Hope into the Yellow Jacket laboratory. He proudly shows off his progress, eager to prove that he became successful without Hank's help. In Darren's mind, this is his moment of victory. Meanwhile, Mitchell arrives at PIM Technologies to purchase the Yellow Jacket suit. Darren looks at Hank and says, "The technology you spent your whole life hiding from me. I'm going to sell it to Hydra." Hearing this makes Hank furious. Without hesitation, he punches Darren in the face. At the same time, Scott reaches the company's main servers with his army of crazy ants. Using the electric devices attached to the ants, he sends a powerful surge through the entire system. Within seconds, all of PIM Technologies' data is destroyed. With the first part of the mission complete, Scott jumps onto Anthony and flies toward the particle chamber. There, he plants several explosives throughout the facility. The plan is simple: steal the Yellow Jacket suit and then destroy the entire building so nobody can recreate the technology again. After setting everything up, Scott lowers himself down toward the Yellow Jacket chamber. But the moment he reaches the suit, Darren traps him. It turns out Darren already knew about their entire plan. He also figured out that Hank chose Scott to become the new Ant-Man. Because just like Hank, Scott was willing to break the rules for the right reasons. Darren takes the Yellow Jacket suit and locks it inside a secure case. Hank tries one last time to stop him. "If you sell this technology to these people, you'll create chaos everywhere." But Darren doesn't care. He replies, "It's already sold." Then he attacks Hank. Just when everything seems lost, Scott uses one of Hank's special discs. He enlarges the tiny prison holding him and breaks free. Now back in action, Ant-Man starts taking down Darren's guards one by one. But during the fight, Darren shoots Hank in the shoulder. Hope is horrified as her father's condition starts getting worse. Darren then tries to kill Scott, but Hope uses the ants to attack him, forcing Darren to escape with the Yellow Jacket case. At the same time, Mitchell manages to steal the PIM particle formula. Darren heads toward the helicopter to escape. Hope tells Scott, "You have to get that suit back." Ant-Man immediately goes after him. He fights through security while Luis also helps from inside the building. Scott races toward the rooftop where Darren's helicopter is waiting. Meanwhile, Luis begins evacuating everyone from the company because he knows the explosives Scott planted are about to destroy the entire building. Hank also reveals one final surprise. He takes out a real tank that he had shrunk years ago. Using the tank, Hank and Hope manage to escape safely. Meanwhile, Darren gets into the helicopter with Mitchell, but before they can leave, Ant-Man arrives. Darren opens fire on him. During the fight, one of the shots hits Anthony. Scott's loyal flying ant falls and dies. Seeing Anthony gone makes Scott angry furious. He charges at Darren with everything he has. Moments later, the explosives finally detonates, and the entire PIM Technologies building collapses into nothing. Everything Hank built disappears. Seeing his company destroyed leaves Darren devastated. Scott continues fighting and defeats the remaining guards. But then Darren puts on the completed Yellow Jacket suit. Now he's even more dangerous. The suit is equipped with powerful weapons and laser technology. The final battle between Ant-Man and Yellow Jacket begins. Both fighters shrink and grow as they attack each other. During the chaos, they end up trapped inside a suitcase and fall from the helicopter, landing straight into a swimming pool. Darren escapes and begins attacking innocent people nearby. Scott immediately jumps back into action to stop him. Using whatever he can find, he fights back and eventually knocks Darren into a bug zapper. For a moment, it looks like the fight is over. But just then, Officer Jim Paxton arrives with his partner Gale. They have been searching for Scott ever since his prison escape. Scott tries to explain everything. He tries to tell them that he's actually stopping a dangerous criminal, but they don't believe him. Before Scott can prove anything, they hit him with a taser, and Ant-Man falls unconscious. But the fight isn't over yet. Darren is still alive. Consumed by anger and desperate for revenge, he goes after the one person Scott loves the most, his daughter Cassie. Darren breaks into the house and takes Cassie hostage. Meanwhile, Officer Jim receives the warning about the attack. Instead of taking Scott back to the police station, he rushes him home. Scott tells him, "I have to save Cassie." But Jim still doesn't fully trust him, so Scott has no choice. He puts on the Ant-Man suit and goes after Darren himself. Using his shrinking abilities, Scott manages to save Cassie, and now, the final battle between Ant-Man and Yellow Jacket begins. The two fight across Cassie's bedroom, but because they're both tiny, everyday toys become a massive battlefield. Toy trains become giant machines. Plastic objects become dangerous obstacles. Scott uses his ants to attack Darren. He also tries using Hank's special discs against him, but during the fight, one of the growth discs accidentally hits an ant, turning it into a giant insect. Another disc hits Cassie's toy train, making it grow to full size. When the police officers see a giant train burst through the house, they're completely shocked. At the same time, Jim arrives and tries to protect Cassie, but Darren attacks them both. Realizing there's only one way to stop him, Scott tries to enter Yellow Jacket's suit and destroy it from the inside, but the openings are too small. Scott understands what he has to do. He disables the safety regulator and shrinks beyond the atomic level. He enters the space between molecules and reaches Darren's suit. From the inside, Scott destroys the Yellow Jacket system, finally defeating Darren. But because of this sacrifice, Scott falls into the quantum realm, a place where time and space have no meaning. Everyone thinks he's gone forever. But then, Scott hears Cassie's voice calling for him. Even lost inside the quantum realm, the love for his daughter gives him the strength to fight back. Desperate to return, Scott modifies the regulator and places one of the enlargement discs inside it. Suddenly, the suit activates, and somehow, Scott escapes the quantum realm. He returns home safely. Seeing her father alive, Cassie becomes incredibly happy. After making sure she's okay, Ant-Man quietly disappears. The next day, Hank asks Scott something impossible. "How did you come back from the quantum realm?" But Scott doesn't remember much about what happened there. The experience was beyond anything he could understand. Hank simply accepts it, but deep down, he realizes something important. If Scott escaped, maybe Janet could still be alive too. Later, Hope walks Scott outside. After everything they've been through together, the two have grown closer, and they finally kiss. Unfortunately, Hank walks in and sees everything. Confused, he asks, "When did this happen?" Scott awkwardly avoids the question and leaves. Afterwards, Scott has dinner at Jim and Maggie's house. Jim has finally forgiven him. He tells Scott that he explained everything to his superiors. According to the official report, Scott never escaped prison. The cameras simply malfunctioned, and Jim had already released him. Scott is relieved. Meanwhile, we discover that Cassie has adopted the giant ant from the fight as her new pet, and she happily feeds it at home. A little later, Scott gets a call from Luis. Luis excitedly tells him another one of his crazy stories. Apparently, his cousin heard that a guy named Wilson, also known as Falcon, is looking for him. Scott becomes nervous, wondering why an Avenger wants to find Ant-Man. Hank takes Hope into a secret room. There, he shows her a special advanced suit. He explains that years ago, he and Janet were designing it together, but Janet disappeared before she ever got the chance to wear it. Now Hank realizes something. Maybe we weren't building it for her. Maybe we were building it for you. Hope smiles, knowing that she will finally get the chance to become a hero too. 1 year later, Steve Rogers and Sam Wilson finally find Bucky, but because of the Sokovia Accords, they can't contact Tony Stark for help. That's when Wilson remembers someone else. He tells Steve, "I know a guy," and the person he's talking about, and with that, the movie comes to an end.